Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Now Ben has to work for his living in order to have enough money to live until Clearview Academy returns his tuition and he can decide what else he can do to make his start in life. Because he is a good mechanic with a level head, he thinks of some ways to speed up the production in the valve assembly part of the automobile plant. His clever innovations bring him to the attention of the owner, John Harrigan, and once again, Ben's future takes a decided new turn. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Winning Basket. Chapter 4. A Sudden Surprise. Ben Mason went on the night shift, and for 3 nights he worked beside Gus Henderson. Gus explained everything about the valve part of the assembly line. He gave Ben his choice of jobs, and Ben decided to fit the valves into place as the engine heads came by. For 3 nights, Ben learned more and more about his job. It was just as the night shift was beginning for the 4th night that the foreman called the entire group of factory workers together. "Men," he said, "we're beginning on advance orders for the new model tonight. This year the factory hasn't made a lot of money. Taxes will eat up all profits before the year is out. This is our one chance to work together. If we keep cars coming off the assembly line, the factory will have a chance to show a profit. That means your homes and jobs will be safe for another year. Well, we're ready now. We have a stiff quota to make, and it's going to take cooperation to see that we make it." The factory workers all cheered, then hurried back to their places. There was a tenseness about the atmosphere that Ben didn't miss. He realized that he was a part of something big, and he enjoyed it. It helped take his mind off the disappointment he had suffered when he was refused entry to Clearview Academy. Back on the line, just before the night shift got underway, Gus Henderson said in a husky whisper, "I'm afraid, Ben, those new men the employment agency sent over don't know too much about this business. Besides, we're short-handed." "Oh, we'll make out all right," Ben said. But an hour later, Ben Mason was beginning to realize just how wrong he had been. Engines were coming down the assembly line in a steady stream, but they were stacking up in front of the valve assembly section. The production chief came hurrying back. He jerked Gus Henderson around by the arm. "What's wrong, Henderson? You're holding up production, and it's costing $1,000 an hour." Gus wiped a perspiring arm across his grease-streaked forehead. "Can't you see what's wrong? We're short-shifted, and we can't possibly get new men for a week. We'll have to send someone to Detroit to recruit help, and that will take time." The production man groaned. "The factory'll lose a small fortune by that time. What are we going to do?" Ben Mason had been taking it all in. At the same time, he had been studying the problem. Suddenly he said, "Gus, I can wipe the valves as I set them into place. That will eliminate a man. Then, on the way back to the valve box, I could inspect the job with a caliper, and that would eliminate the new inspector. The new man could help us with the head bolts, and that would speed us up." Gus looked doubtful. "You can't handle 3 jobs, Ben." "I could try," Ben exclaimed. "It's better than nothing." The production man was enthusiastic. "He's right, Gus. The least we can do is try. If we can hold out until we get help, well, it'll save a lot of men jobs." And so it began. Ben worked the shift. When he was through, his back was aching and his entire body was numb, but he had the satisfaction of knowing that a job was well done. When the shift was over, Gus said to him, "Ben, stay with me a bit. We'll show the next shift how to double as we have done. You know, there's a chance that we'll be able to make production quota after all, thanks to you." "Of course I'll help," Ben said. Inwardly, he was glowing at the praise of his superior. And so Ben stayed. He worked 2 more hours, thankful that he had a job at all. And when he went home, it was to fall in bed and immediately go into a heavy slumber. And that was not the last of it. Ben had to work that way every night until the new help came from Detroit. But though his young body was tired, there was a certain satisfaction in seeing the cars glide swiftly down the assembly line without a single break in the routine. Ben was just coming to work for the 10th night when he was stopped at the gate by a guard. "Message for you, Mason." The guard handed Ben a note. Ben read it, and his first reaction was one of apprehension. The note was from John Harrigan's secretary. It said, "Mr. Harrigan would like to see you in his office the moment you come to work. Don't bother to change into your work clothes." Suddenly, Ben wondered if he was about to be let out. New men had been brought in from Detroit, and it was true that they had a wealth of experience, all of them. But Ben needn't have wondered a minute. The moment he stepped into the ornate office of the company's founder, he realized it. "Hello, Ben. Sit down a moment, will you?" John Harrigan was smiling in a friendly manner, and Ben felt better. "Ben, I told you once that if a man showed ability, he'd get a chance to use it. Well, I meant every word of it. I've had a report from Henderson, and he tells me that you're the one who ironed out a very severe production wrinkle. I'm grateful. You're a smart young man, Ben, but you don't belong in an automobile factory, not yet. Tell me, what's the reason for you being here in the first place?" Well, Ben evaded. "I needed a job and—" "Come, Ben," John Harrigan chided. "Let's have no secrets. I want you to be perfectly frank with me." Ben's problem had been worrying him for long hours, and now he felt that it would be a relief to share it with someone. So he started at the beginning. He told John Harrigan of his memories of the flood, of Gramps and Granny, and finally he explained how he had been accepted at Clearview Academy by mistake, then was swiftly rejected when the mistake was made clear. "So you see," Ben said, "I had to get something to do and get it quickly. My money is waiting at the academy by now, and I suppose that in the back of my mind there's the thought that I might someday go to another military academy." Then Ben shrugged. "But of course I'll have to have a lot more money than I have now. If I keep working—" "Don't even mention working, Ben Mason. Do you know what I'm going to do with you? I'm going to see that you enroll again at Clearview. You have stuff in you that I want to see developed. Oh, don't try to thank me. You've already saved me 10 times what I'll spend on you. As for your being an orphan, forget it. They'll let you into the academy all right. I've given them 6 big buildings. They won't dare refuse. Now keep quiet if you're going to start thanking me. Right now I want to show you something. My car's waiting." Dazedly, Ben followed his benefactor outside. He climbed into the back seat of the luxurious car, and for once, John Harrigan had a chauffeur. He got in beside Ben. "The thing I can't understand," Ben exclaimed, "is why you're taking such an interest in me, Mr. Harrigan. It is hard to understand," Harrigan said, a faraway look in his eyes. "As a matter of fact, I don't exactly know why myself. Maybe it's because my own son is no longer with me. You see, he went to war. He was badly wounded. He never came back." "I'm sorry, sir," Ben said. "He must have been a fine young man." The long car sped through the streets, and for a long time both occupants in the rear seat were silent. Finally, the car swept up into a drive, drew to a stop beneath a large projection that extended from the mansion to the drive. Ben followed Harrigan up to the door. down a long hallway and into the library. There were thousands of richly bound books. There were many glass cases filled with rare curios. It was such a sight as Ben had never dreamed possible. He was speechless. "Well, how do you like it, Ben? Say something." Ben turned and stammered, I'm lost for words, sir. If I only had a chance to leaf through these books, why—" Harrigan's laughter silenced Ben. "Oh, you'll have time, Ben, but only during the summers. You see, I've decided to try a little experiment. I'm going to have you make this your home when you aren't in school." Ben sought a chair and he sat down. "I don't mean to be rude," he exclaimed, "but this business is all so new to me. I don't even know how to start asking questions." John Harrigan was suddenly serious again. He pulled up a huge leather chair beside Ben. "You needn't talk, Ben. I'll do the talking. I have a story to tell, and that's why I brought you here. I want you to pay attention to every word of it." Ben leaned back, eagerly awaiting the story. It soon came. "You see, Ben, I'm getting to be an old man. I raised my own son to take over my business. But as I told you, I lost that son. For a while my life was pretty empty, and I was a bitter man, I'm afraid. But one night I got an idea. I decided to train a boy to take my place. Someone who would have the knowledge and the ability to take over after I'm gone. It's a big assignment, Ben, so big that I'm not even sure you have the ability to fill it. But that's the gamble I'm willing to take. For years I've been casting about for likely young men. I've thought at least a dozen times that I've found my man. But always at the last moment, each applicant fails me. It's discouraging, Ben, but I keep trying. To make a long story short, I'm sponsoring one young fellow now. He's a bright chap and I like him. I'm taking you into my home, and I'm giving you the same opportunities. Between the two of you there might spring up a rivalry, but that would be only natural. Good, clean competition never hurt anyone. I'm not asking you to transfer your affections to me, or to look upon me as a foster parent. You owe your allegiance to those good friends of yours, Gramps and Granny. But I do ask that you be loyal to me and to yourself, Ben. If you can prove to me that my choice was a wise one, you'll never regret it. And now, since I've told you my plan, I imagine you'd like to have time to think it over. Your bedroom is at the head of the stairway. In the morning we'll go over to the academy and enroll you again. With a little work you'll be able to catch up in your studies." Ben was beginning to realize that he was indeed awake, and once again he was learning that diligence paid huge dividends. It would have been so easy for him to quit fighting, but his indomitable spirit to come back in the face of superhuman odds was again proving its worth. But there was one thing that puzzled Ben. I've always wanted to go to a military school," he said slowly, "and I still want to. It's an overpowering urge that I can't explain. But there's one thing that does worry me. Those boys are all sons of rich men. They made it pretty plain that an orphan wasn't too welcome. I'd hate to feel that I wasn't good enough for them." "You're quite right in thinking as you do, Ben, but you're mistaken about one thing. Down underneath at Clearview, there's a spirit and tradition about the place that's wonderful. Of course, there are naturally good cadets and bad ones, but you'll find such a ratio in all walks of life. If you go there and prove that you're a man, you'll come out on top. They may resent you a bit at first, but you're going to have to expect that. Just keep fighting back. Keep believing that you're as good as the next fellow, and everything will end as you wish it to. Well, I've said about all there is to say. Good night, Ben." Ben Mason's throat was tight. He offered the elder man his hand. "Good night, sir, and thanks a million." The next morning, Ben and John Harrigan drove over to the academy. They went immediately to the office of President Smathers. John Harrigan made no pretense of beating about the bush. He went directly to the point. "Smathers, I'm sponsoring young Mason here. See that he's enrolled in the right classes. He has $500 coming. Credit it to his account in the school bank. Send all his other bills to me. I trust there will be no trouble." President Smathers looked embarrassed. No trouble at all, John. And about the boy's misfortune a few days ago. I'm deucedly sorry about it. When I heard it, I was terribly perturbed. But I hope you understand our position. Of course, now that you're behind him, it's entirely different. I hope the young man won't entertain any hard feelings toward us." "If he does," Harrigan blurted, "I'll box the young scamp's ears. Well, hurry up, Smathers, and assign him to a room. I want to see that he's settled before I leave." Ben was swiftly taken care of. He was given a room in Dormitory D, a dorm tenanted by all first-year men. On the way over, Harrigan said, "Just a moment, Ben, let's go in here. I have another surprise for you." Curiously, Ben followed Harrigan into an upper-class dorm. They walked up a flight of stairs. Harrigan was saying, "You remember what I told you last night? I said I was sponsoring another boy. Well, I'm going to introduce you to him. He'll see to it that you get to know the right people. There's nothing like having a friend in need." Ben was overjoyed. "Knowing an upperclassman will certainly be a break for me," he admitted. "You seem to think of everything, Mr. Harrigan." But Ben's joy soon turned to gloom. For when Harrigan shoved open a door, they were face to face with Jack Lassiter. Lassiter looked surprised, but he covered his confusion with a smile when he saw John Harrigan. "Jack, this is Ben Mason. I'm sponsoring him just as I'm sponsoring you. Whichever of you turns out to suit my fancy best, well, that is the one who will take over a mighty important position in the nation's industry. Shake hands. I want you to know each other better." Numbly, Ben shook hands while he heard Lassiter say, "Oh, we've known each other since last week sometime. But I am anxious to know him better. Very anxious." Lassiter was speaking in apparent sincerity, but was there another meaning behind his words? Was it really anger and chagrin that Ben thought he heard behind Lassiter's words? John Harrigan didn't notice. He smiled at both of them, then made ready to depart. "Jack can take you over to your room, Ben. You're in capable hands, and I'm not worried about leaving you. I'll be over from time to time to see you both." Then John Harrigan turned to Jack. "You especially, Jack. I'm anxious to see how the new basketball team goes against Corona. When's the first game? In a couple of weeks, isn't it?" "Right," Jack said. 2 weeks from this Friday. And don't worry about us, sir. We'll stand 'em on their ears." "Just the same. Corona won the Southern Conference last season. They'll be tough." "But we'll be as tough, sir." John Harrigan grinned as he closed the door. Lassiter turned to him when they were alone. "Well, Mr. Plebe," he snarled threateningly, "you think you're a wise one, don't you? The minute my back is turned, you worm your way into the good graces of John Harrigan. Until you came along, I had the Harrigan Automobile Factory sewed up as my future. But you've made him fall for your slick ways. Well, let me give you a tip, Mason. You're up from the gutter, and I'm going to kick you back down there. You may think you've won John Harrigan's sympathy, but by the time I get through with you, you'll wish you'd never seen him. Now beat it, plebe, before I get good and sore and make you scrub out this room." Every emotion within Ben Mason was upon the verge of explosion. Keeping his head in such a predicament was the hardest thing he had ever done. Yet he realized that his entire mode of life had been changed. Now he was a cadet. He was a member of a large organization that was training the leaders of the future. He was a part of a great spirit and tradition. It was not within his province of thought to spoil it. So although it was the hardest thing he ever did, Ben Mason stood sharply at attention. He saluted Jack Lassiter, for Jack Lassiter was an upperclassman. "Yes, sir," he said. "I'm leaving, sir." Then sharply Ben spun around and left. He began to go down the stairs 2 at a time. But before he left, he heard Jack Lassiter's angry shouts. "Pudge! Rod! Lard! All you guys, come here a minute. I want to tell you what a louse has just done." Leaving, Ben knew that Jack Lassiter would try to turn the whole campus against him. It was a bitter pill, but one he had to take, for Ben Mason had become a cadet. Chapter 5. A Cadet Never Complains. From the first day it was evident that Ben was in for some tough sledding. To begin with, the word of his re-entry into Clearview swept along the campus grapevine like flame through a forest. No sooner had Ben reached his dormitory than he was visited by 2 upper-class cadets. One was Lard, Jack Lassiter's crony. The other introduced himself. "Plebe," he snapped, "don't bother about straightening up your room. Right now you're supposed to learn a few things. I'm Dave Monroe. My job is to see that you new plebes keep your things straightened around. Every day before breakfast your room will be inspected. That means up and out at 6. Bed made, shoes shined, everything in place, see? At night you're in bed by 10 and all lights are out. I make an inspection every hour until midnight. The campus guard checks every hour after that. There won't be any monkey business after hours. No slipping out. That's my job, and I'm going to enforce it. One other thing, plebe. When something happens and the going gets tough, I don't want to hear any beefing out of you. We've got a saying around here, and we believe in it. A cadet never complains, no matter what happens. Got it?" Ben said, "I have it, sir. Anything else?" "Yes, just one more thing. I hear rumors about you, plebe. I hear that you're stubborn, that you like to have your own way. I hear you're pretty stuck on yourself." Ben was suddenly annoyed. He stood there, hands on hips, eyes flashing. "If you've been hearing things," Ben said coldly, "you've been hearing them from Jack Lassiter. He's the only one I've talked to since I enrolled." Dave Monroe started to say something. His face was contorted in sudden anger. But the door opened and Rod King came in. Behind Rod was Hal Chase, the heavy-set, friendly-looking upper-class cadet who had given Ben his first order on the campus. Seeing the visitors, Monroe nudged Lard, and the pair began to edge toward the door. But their faces were still dark under scowls, and Ben realized that they were very much on the other side of the fence, on Lassiter's side. "Just heard you returned," Rod King grinned, shaking Ben's hand. "You remember Chase? He's a guard on the basketball team. Before we get down to business, I'll ask you something. I just wonder if you were having any trouble with Monroe and Lard Adams. I saw them in deep conference with Lassiter. As a matter of fact, that was when I heard you were here." Ben remembered. A cadet never complains. So he smiled and said, "No trouble at all. They were just telling me some of the things I should know, mostly about inspection." Rod King's face wrinkled in thought. Finally he said, "Well, I hate to borrow trouble, but I'll give you a word to the wise. Monroe makes it tough on plebes, Ben, particularly when he's influenced by an upperclassman. Right now I'm not going to say any more. But watch your step, boy. When inspection time comes around in the morning, be sure that every hair is combed just so. Get those blankets folded exactly right. And if there's a speck of dirt on the furniture, you can expect Monroe to find it." "I'm being cheerful, aren't I?" "As a matter of fact," Ben said slowly, "you're being swell. Look, Rod, you aren't fooling me. You know what kind of a time I'm going to have around here for a while. A garage mechanic, enrolled in a school of young millionaires. It isn't going to help your popularity a bit to be seen around me." "Cut it," Hal Chase interrupted. "And how about us getting on a pleasanter subject? As we were about to say when we first came in, Mason, the basketball season's almost ready to get started. We have a good team this year, but we need more reserve strength. We need to build toward next season." "It's nice of you to call on me," Ben said modestly. "Of course, I'm going to play, but I'm not so sure I'll have the stuff you're looking for." That's up to me to decide, Rod King said. Up to me and the coach. I've already called on the coach, Captain Craig. Don't be surprised if he gives you a visit and invites you to practice with the varsity squad. Ordinarily, you'd play on the plebe team, but if there's a chance that you can make the varsity, then you can bet we'll try to turn you into a player in a hurry. Frankly, I've told you that there was a chance. The rest is up to you. Rod started to leave, but as an apparent afterthought, he said, I needn't tell you, Ben, that becoming a basketball man would solve about all your problems. Maybe that gives you another reason to work. Long after his visitors were gone, Ben Mason sat on the foot of his bed thinking. In his first evening, he had 2 sets of visitors. The first represented an element that would work against him. The second had represented the element that for a little while at least he could expect to have on his side. Ben wondered how the rest of the campus would be divided, wondered how the rest of the cadets would like to hear that in their midst was an orphan who had had much of his education in the workaday world, in a common small-town garage. Ben slept on that. Then, when the bugler sent a jolting blast of bugle notes through the crisp, cool air, Ben climbed out of bed. First, he raced down the hall and had a quick shower. Other plebes entered the shower room. Some of them nodded. Others paid him no attention. Ben had no time to introduce himself right then. He was thinking of the many things he had to do by the time he went to breakfast, an hour later. After a hot shower and an ice-cold rinse, Ben rubbed himself down briskly with a towel, then went back to his room. It was a small room. It contained a bed, a desk, a closet, and 2 chairs. There was a diagram on the wall, showing where every object was to be placed. Hurriedly, Ben arranged things. Then he wiped the furniture and floor with an oiled rag. Satisfied that the room was ready for inspection, Ben took his toothbrush and paste and headed again for the shower room. He had 5 minutes to brush his teeth and return to the room to stand inspection. He wondered vaguely how Dave Monroe could possibly find anything wrong with the way he had arranged his room. But almost 5 minutes later, Ben Mason got the surprise of his young life. He walked back into his room, and it was like walking into a town through which a cyclone had just swept. The bed was turned upside down. The covers were on the floor. The closet door was open, and the clean clothes that Ben had hung on hangers were now carelessly thrown into the corners. The drawers were pulled out of the desk, and papers were strewn from them. The wall mirror had been pulled from its hanging place, and someone had thoughtfully made the whole thing look a bit more realistic by throwing a handful of dirt upon the floor. In short, the place looked like nothing Ben had ever seen before. His first impulse was anger. His second was to get the chaos straightened in time for inspection. But he realized at once this could not be done, so he hastened outside his room. He left the door standing open. At that moment, Lassiter and Lard Adams came calmly walking down the steps. Too calmly, Ben thought. Lassiter looked into Ben's room. My, he said in a shocked tone. What lovely housekeeping do you indulge in? I wonder, plebe, if you wouldn't mind teaching me your system. Of course, I couldn't pay you what it's really worth. Before Ben could summon a retort, Dave Monroe stepped out of the adjoining room. Ben saluted, stood in front of his open doorway. His eyes were straight ahead, his cheeks aflame. He heard Lard and Lassiter move away. Their not too veiled laughter didn't improve Ben's peace of mind. If you're trying to be smart, Dave Monroe snapped, you picked the wrong guy to be smart with. Plebe, you go without your breakfast to straighten this room. Your schedule card tells me that you don't have to report to class until 10. Okay, instead of using that for a study period, you begin your punishment. Report to me at 7:30 in the basement. I'll assign you to your new tools: a brush, a broom, a mop, and a water bucket. For a week you can scrub the halls. The next time I find your room in a mess like this, you get 2 weeks on the mop brigade." "Well, so long, plebe. Happy thoughts while I eat my usual 2 eggs for breakfast." Ben's was the last room on the floor, and with a cheery wave, Monroe, the room inspector, moved away. After a moment, Ben shrugged, walked back into his room, and began to straighten things. He didn't have to do a lot of guessing. Lassiter and Lard had either fixed his room themselves or ordered someone else to do it. But Ben could do nothing in the way of retaliation. As a matter of fact, he was already planning on other methods of procedure. It had been drilled into him that basketball was a very important winter pastime at Clearview Academy. It was also easy to see that Lassiter was a big man on the basketball team. Very well. Before it was over, Ben wanted to fight it out in his own way, on the basketball court. He would either vindicate himself, or he would fail. But whichever it would be before the eyes of hundreds of his fellow cadets. The fight would be conducted out in the open, and the rules of good sportsmanship would prevail. At least, if Ben won his battle, he wouldn't win it by gossip and by petty tricks, such as messing up rooms just before inspection time. Ben managed to clean his room within the half-hour period. Through his window he could see the cadets, marching out of the commons, contentment on their faces after a hearty breakfast. Within a few moments, his door opened, and Monroe came in again. Monroe went over the room with a microscopic eye. He seemed disappointed when he could find nothing about which to complain. Finally he said, "Okay, plebe, get into some old clothes. Your session on the mop-up squad is about to begin." And thus it was that Ben, through no fault of his own, soon found himself in the inglorious job of wiping up the halls of the plebe dorm. To add to his discomfort, there was always Dave Monroe at his shoulder, telling him of a fleck of mud he had missed. "I tell you, plebe, you sure you don't mind this? The way you're looking at that mop, a guy would think you're actually enjoying your job. Oh, well, I guess you learn to like dirty work around a garage, eh? It's a good thing, too, plebe, because you're going to have plenty of mopping to do before the year's over. Now you just quit paying attention to what I'm saying, plebe. Get your nose back down in the suds bucket and get to work." Ben said nothing. He kept thinking that he was in for a very unpleasant future in that dormitory. He could visualize what would happen. Every time he stepped out of his room, someone would step inside and ruin it for inspection. It wasn't a pleasant prospect. But try as he might, Ben could think of no way of getting out from under Monroe's domination. It was perhaps 10 minutes later that the door opened, and a uniformed man came in. The man was tall and straight, and his eyes were the clearest brown Ben had ever seen. There was a half-twinkle in them as he regarded the tableau before him. Ben saw Dave Monroe salute. He stood in the middle of a soapy puddle and saluted himself. "Carry on," the officer said, apparently dismissing Ben. Then to Monroe, "I'm looking for a new chap who just came over here. His name is Mason, Ben Mason. Where's his room, guard?" Dave Monroe gulped. Then he pointed at Ben. "This is the one you're looking for, I guess? He's on duty for having a messed-up room." The man swung around. "Mason," he said, "I'm Captain Craig, the basketball coach. Rod King was telling me about you. The gym is empty right now. Hurry out of those clothes and into something decent. I want you to run over there with me for a bit. If you have anything, I'll soon be able to see it." Ben began to smile. He heard Monroe's startled protest. If you don't mind, Captain, I wish you'd leave Mason with me for a while longer. He's serving time for a rule infraction and—" "Later, perhaps," Captain Craig said stiffly. "Right now, the basketball team might need Mason a lot more than the cleanup squad. If you're short-handed, perhaps you can do some of the mopping yourself, guard." Ben grinned as he walked into his room. He felt suddenly better. Captain Craig followed him inside, took a chair, while Ben climbed into his gray uniform. "Ordinarily," Captain Craig said, "a coach doesn't go around looking up new men before they have a chance to get located. But the fact is, Mason, We're terribly in need of reserve strength, and I'm not overlooking a single possibility." Ben eased into a light overcoat and followed the coach from the room. "Then, too," Captain Craig said in a suddenly confidential tone, "I have another reason, Mason. I've heard well, to be frank, I know about your background. There's nothing wrong with it, understand, but it will be difficult to prove that to a bunch of cadets who've never had to wonder about money. Basketball is your chance to prove your mettle. I'm telling you this because, if you know it, you'll give everything you have toward becoming a star on the varsity." The coach's tone was soft and resonant. Ben found himself liking it, liking the man behind it immensely. "It's swell of you, sir, to tell me these things." They reached the field house, walked through the door, down a long hall and into the gymnasium. It was empty. Captain Craig indicated a pair of gym shoes, and as Ben was putting them on, the coach continued, "I may as well let you in on a little secret, Mason. I went to military school because a rich man thought enough of me to pay the way. I was a poor boy amid rich surroundings. I had a battle on my hands all the way. Once in a while I found a person who was friendly, despite my lack of family background. I've always had a warm spot in my heart for those few friends. Maybe that's another reason I'm interested in you." Captain Craig was suddenly very brisk. "But now, we came in here to see if you can play basketball. Let's not waste our time on foolish chatter. Now, Mason, take this ball. Dribble up and down the court. I want to see how you handle yourself." Ben began to bounce the ball in slow, deliberate dribbles. "Do you know the rules of the game, Mason? No, don't come back up here. Take a few short shots at the basket while I talk to you. We haven't much time." Ben's chest felt constricted, but there was nothing else to do but to admit the truth. I've never played basketball. I'm pretty much of a greenhorn. I'm sorry if I've taken your time and—" "Quiet, Mason," the coach snapped. "You don't have to know too many rules to be a player. It's the referee's job to know when to stop the game because of a rule infraction. Of course, you'll learn the finer points in time, but right now there are only a few really important rules to remember. First, never use your hands on a player at any time or in any manner. You can touch the ball when someone else has it, but never touch the man, or the referee will call a foul, and it'll cost a free toss at the basket. Another thing to remember, when you're dribbling and stop for some reason or another, you can't start dribbling again. You have to pass it or shoot it. Nor can you run with the ball like you do in football. Now, those are 3 main rules. If you remember them, then learn the fundamentals, you'll be all right. The other things, the regular procedure of the game, will come as you play. Think you can remember what I said?" Ben wasn't at all confused. "I remember, I believe," he said. "Hands off an opposing player, no running with the ball, and no dribbling once the dribble has been stopped. That's easy." Ben had continued to shoot at the basket as the rules were explained to him. Now the coach came out onto the floor. "When you're standing back of the basket, say 15 feet, try to shoot higher, arch the ball. That way it has more of a chance of coming down through the netting. Yeah, that's the way. That was a beauty. Simple, wasn't it?" To Ben, who had just sent a beautiful long shot swishing through the netting, it was indeed simpler than he had imagined. He continued to shoot a while, but what Captain Craig was thinking wasn't visible on his face. Finally, the captain called a halt. "Just a minute, Mason, while I write a note for you." After a moment, Ben had the short note. He waited curiously until Captain Craig said, "Take that note to your dormitory guard. I expect he'll be disappointed to see it. As for you, Mason, I like the way you can handle the ball. Oh, don't get the idea that you can learn basketball in a week. You can't. It takes the better players years to master the game. But you've shown me that you have the ability and the desire to learn. From now on, until further notice, I want you to practice with the varsity squad. Tonight you'll be assigned a second-team uniform. Practice is at 4 in the afternoon. I'll be expecting you." Ben was overjoyed. He was about to express himself when a warning look in the coach's eyes silenced him. And just as Ben prepared to leave, he heard, "Today, Mason, I took you under my wing because you were a new man. I want you to know that I have your interests at heart, but in the future you can't expect extra consideration from me. I'm the coach of the entire varsity. There are a lot of conflicting interests. My job is to please everyone and not play favorites. I want you to come through and I'll help you all I can. But when I think you'll need calling down, I'm going to give it to you. Good luck, Mason, and don't disappoint me." Ben saluted sharply. Then he hurried back to his dormitory. He went inside, saw Dave Monroe scowling at a corridor that was still unwashed. Ben started into his room, but Monroe stopped him. "Wait a minute, wise guy," Monroe shouted. "There's still work to do. This place has to be cleaned. I'll expect you back here after your last class today." "Sorry," Ben said quietly, "but I won't be here." And then, before Monroe could recover, Ben handed him the note the coach had written. The note said, "You will excuse Ben Mason from further duties. He's now a member of the basketball squad." Chapter 6. Basketball at Last. There were no more mussed-up rooms for Ben Mason after the basketball coach handed him the note that excused him from further duty around the dormitory. And the next evening, when basketball practice was called, Ben was on the floor, eager, expectant, awaiting the big test that would decide whether or not he had the ability to remain with the squad. The coach summoned the prospective squadsmen out into the center of the floor. "Men," he said gravely, "there are more than 30 of you. I'm sorry, but we're only going to be able to keep 16 of you on the squad. That will be a first and a second team, as well as 3 replacements for each team. You 16 lucky men will make all the varsity trips. You will be the raw material from which I will try to fashion a championship 5. Tonight we're going to have a practice game. I've already decided on my varsity team. However, if a man proves that he is better than those I have selected, that man will get his chance. I'm not playing favorites. The selections are in the laps of the gods. For my varsity, I want Brown and Lassiter as forwards. Those 2 men are fast. They can shoot straight and get points. Rod King, your center as usual. At guards, we're using last year's lettermen, Lard Adams and Hal Chase. I'll substitute quite frequently. To begin, I'll use these 5 men on the opposing team." Ben listened, but his name was not called. He felt a bit disconsolate, but his spirits arose when the coach called him over on the bench to sit beside him. The coach said, "Before you go out there, Ben, I want you to be familiar with all of the rules, at least with enough of them that you'll be able to know what to do. There, you see, at the beginning of the game and at the start of the half, the opposing centers jump for the ball in the center of the floor." Ben watched as the 2 centers, Rod King of the varsity and Whalen of the seconds, leaped high for the ball. Rod's fingers brushed the ball first, sent it spinning into the outstretched hands of Jack Lassiter. Lassiter began to dribble the ball down the sideline, swiftly and expertly. Ben had to admire him for the way he handled himself. The seconds, with the ball out of their possession, fell back toward their own basket, arms outstretched on defense, to prevent the ball from being driven through them. Jack Lassiter was trapped by a second-team guard. He whirled around and threw the ball to Hal Chase. Chase faked a shot at the basket. Then, when the second-team players came out to stop the shot, Chase bounced the ball across the floor to Lassiter, who was breaking away from his guard. Lassiter took the ball, dribbled once, leaped into the air, and drove the ball through for 2 points. As Lassiter was shooting, a second-team guard reached for him, missed the ball, but touched Lassiter's arm. The referee immediately blew his whistle. "You see," Captain Craig explained to Ben, "Lassiter gets a free throw because the guard touched him with his hands. In basketball, that's holding. It doesn't pay. See, Lassiter made the free throw, and now he gets an extra point. The varsity's leading 3-0. In just a few moments, the varsity ran up a score of 8 points, while the scrubs were held scoreless. Ben sat there beside his coach, devouring every bit of information Captain Craig passed his way. He learned other small rules that helped him understand the game. Instead of throwing the ball up at center again after one team made a basket, he saw that the other team was given the ball out of bounds. The coach, seeing his puzzled expression, said, "That's a new rule, Ben. It used to be that centers jumped after each score, but now it's different. They made the new rule to make it fair for teams that didn't have tall centers. Now suppose your team scores. That gives you an advantage. To even it up, the referee gives the ball to the opposing team. They put it in play from beneath your basket. That gives them a chance to even the score and make it more interesting for the spectator. Now do you understand?" "I understand," Ben said. "So much so that I believe I could scrimmage along with the seconds without getting myself into too much difficulty." "That's what I've waited for you to say. Very well, Ben. You're on your own now. Get into the game at forward in the place of Cardigan." Ben walked over to the scorekeeper and reported, "Mason in for Cardigan." Then, when the whistle was blown, he stepped onto the court and reported again to the referee. He had already been warned that failure to report would give the other side a free throw, and with the varsity leading by such a long score, Ben didn't want them to get any more on his account. "Well, if it isn't the mechanic," Lassiter said as they lined up for the next play. "How long do you think you're going to last?" Ben was trying to think of a fitting retort when the varsity threw the ball into play. Before he could get back to guard his goal, Jack Lassiter had taken the ball and driven in behind him. It was Ben's fault, and Ben knew it. His ears began to burn as the coach shouted from the sideline, "You can know every rule in the book, Mason, and still be a poor player if you don't know any more than to go to sleep on the playing floor. Now wake up." Grimly, Ben Mason awoke and stayed that way. Chapter 7. These Men Shall Stay. When Ben entered the game, the score was 11-1 in the varsity's favor, and the quick basket by Lassiter gave the varsity another 2 points. And the first period of 10 minutes was not quite over. The scrubs got the ball out of bounds under the basket, and immediately began to work it down the court. Ben, who was a forward, raced down the floor and took up a position under his own basket. Jack Lassiter was guarding Ben to keep him from receiving a pass from one of his mates. And Lassiter was doing a bang-up job of guarding. He clung to Ben like a leech, refused to let him get as much as half a stride ahead. Every scrub was covered, and the scrub guard, Holt, who was in possession of the ball, had to throw it to someone, or have it taken away from him. He tossed it to Ben. Ben fought his way upward and away from Lassiter, but Lassiter was on him like a dark shadow. They leaped together, varsity man and scrub player. They strained for the ball, caught it together. They came down, still locking the ball between them. The referee blew his whistle and called for a jump. Ben faced Lassiter and studied him. Could he out-jump the taller man, he wondered? The referee tossed the ball into the air. Ben leaped high, as if out-jumping Jack Lassiter was the most important assignment in his life. Ben's leap was timed perfectly. He touched the ball a split second before Lassiter reached it. Ben batted it to Whalen, the second-team center, who was waiting at the free-throw line. Whalen took the ball, whirled toward the basket. The ball left his fingers, shot toward the hoop, but the attempt missed by inches, and the ball, after rolling around the rim, fell outside. Ben Mason had discovered that it paid to be under the basket when a shot was missed. Now he was ready. A step ahead of Lassiter, he reached high, took the ball as it rebounded from the backboard. With a slight flick of his wrist, he sent the ball upward again. This time it hit on the spot a few inches above the net, bounced backward, and fell through the netting for a clean score. "That's the way to go, Mason," Whalen enthused. "A few more like that and we'll have the varsity sitting on the bench." Rod King looked approval, but Rod wasn't showing Ben any favors, not on the basketball floor. He fought him as if he were an opponent from the rival Navy Prep. All during the rest of that first quarter the battle raged, up and down the court. First one side had the ball, then the other. But at the end of the period, the seconds were doing better. The score was 15-7. Ben Mason had managed to make 3 of the scrubs' points. During the rest period, the coach came out onto the floor. "I'm doing some substituting," he said. "Some of you men aren't in the right kind of condition. You have to train to play basketball. You can't fill up on sweet stuff and expect to be able to have a lot of wind. It just isn't done. You can eat a pie and play a piccolo in the school band, but pie eaters don't belong on the basketball squad. A word to the wise should be sufficient. Now, on the scrubs, I want to see Harrigan back in at 1 forward. Mace, you get out of the game. Holt, you stay, and Blue, I want you in the other guard." The coach looked at Ben, then said, "Mason, you stay in the game a while. You aren't blowing like a whale yet." At that announcement, Ben saw a dark look cross Jack Lassiter's face. That gave Ben cause for thought. He knew that Lassiter didn't like the way he was making out. That told Ben he should watch out for any sort of trouble. At the beginning of the next period, Ben kept an eye on Lassiter. At the jump, the varsity again got the ball due to Rod King's excellent leap. The ball was tapped to Lassiter. Ben leaped into the air with Lassiter, but this time the varsity man was too good for Ben, and Lassiter came down with the ball in his possession. He began to dribble down the court with Ben in hot pursuit. Ben was watching for tricks, but he wasn't ready for what happened. Lassiter suddenly stopped. Ben crashed into him, and at that very moment saw Lard Adams, who had been trailing the play, crash into Ben. Thus it was that Ben was caught between the 2 players, much like a man caught between 2 trucks. The impact sent him hurtling through the air, but even before he hit the floor, he felt the sharp, stabbing pain in the small of his back, where Lard's knee had caught him. Ben went down rolling in agony. It felt as if his back were broken. For a few brief seconds, his eyes were clouded over with a kind of red film, and the shapes in front of his eyes were blurry, hard to distinguish shadows. But gradually his senses came back to him. He felt strong hands rub over his injury, hands that seemed to be pressing the pain from him. Bending over him was the coach. "Are you hurt, Mason? Is your back all right now?" Ben managed a smile of sorts. I think I'll be all right now, sir, if you'll let me walk around a bit." Ben climbed to his feet. Groggily he began to walk around, but Hal Chase and Rod King were on either side to support him. At the same time, the coach began to talk to Lassiter and Lard. "Lassiter, what kind of clumsy basketball was that?" "Why, I didn't know he was behind me," Lassiter said. "I stopped to throw the ball to Hal, and then he hit me. I don't see that I was being clumsy. Mason was the clumsy one." The coach didn't say anything, and Ben wondered if that meant he was agreeing with Lassiter. After a while, Ben was able to limp around by himself. Hiding his real hurt, he said, "I'm ready to go now." "The only place you're going, young man, is to the bench. You can't play in the condition you're in. Now get on in there. I'll send a substitute player in for you." Ben walked to the bench and sat down. The varsity got to clicking during the second period. They made a runaway race of the game, and at the half, the coach called all the players into the locker room. While they were resting, Coach Craig addressed them. "I'm not at all satisfied with what I've seen so far. You men on the varsity have been playing listless ball. Oh, you're ahead in the game all right, but you're playing against inexperienced men. What would you do if you were up against Navy Prep? I don't know what's wrong unless it's that you haven't got enough spark. All of you varsity men are good players, but you don't play like an inspired team. Unless you snap out of it, you're going to be a disgrace to your school and to yourselves. I know that isn't nice talk, but my business is to tell the truth, even if it hurts. I'm supposed to make a basketball team out of you. If I fail, the student body, every single solitary person connected with this school, is going to blame me." Ben looked around. He saw the flushes on the faces of the varsity team. He saw the look of puzzled shame on Rod King's usually pleasant countenance. He felt sorry for Rod. But he knew the coach spoke the truth. "There's another thing you fellows apparently have forgotten. There's such a thing as training. Or are you too good to train? Every basketball player needs at least 8 hours of sleep. When you go to bed at 10 and have to get up at 6, you don't get 8 hours, because you don't go right to sleep. If it takes you an hour to go to sleep, climb in bed at 9. It's nice to have warm rooms in the wintertime, but fresh air is even nicer. Open the windows and enjoy the air. You'll have fewer colds, but be sure to keep your bodies covered. I didn't intend to give you a lecture at this stage of the game, but I may as well now that I've begun. And there's another thing that's even more important. More basketball teams have been ruined by poor eating habits than poor sleeping ones. Worse than not getting the right kind of rest is not getting the correct foods. We have a cafeteria here at the academy, and every man is allowed to select the kind of meal he likes. But that doesn't go for basketball men. Later we'll have a training table for the squad, but in the meantime you'll have to use your judgment. Now that this is off my chest, I'm ready to see you get out there for the second half. I haven't made up my mind yet as to which of you I'm going to keep, but you'll know before the day is over. That's all. Let's get the game underway." Ben went out with the rest, and like the rest he was eager to start the second half to show his ability. But Ben didn't get the starting assignment. Instead, it went to Cardigan, another second-team hopeful. While the two teams were battling it out during the second period, Ben noticed a whole host of cadets up in the balcony that surrounded the gym. He was puzzled at that until a teammate told him, "Those are the ones who are out of class. Before the practice session is over, the whole student body will be in here watching the workout. They're proud of basketball here at Clearview, and they're proud of their team." Ben wondered how it would be to play in front of all of those cadets. Would they accept him as one of them? Particularly after some of the gossip that had been going around the campus concerning him. Ben was half afraid the coach would put him into the game, and then, as the crowd increased and the game faded into its dying moments, Ben grew even more afraid that he wouldn't get his chance to play again. With only 4 minutes to go, and the seconds hopelessly beaten, the coach suddenly turned to Ben. "How do you feel, Mason? Think you can go in and give an account for yourself?" "Can I?" Ben exclaimed. "I could play with a broken leg the way I feel now. Just give me the chance." "Okay, report for Cardigan. Let's see some baskets." Ben hated to admit it, but his injury was still bothering him. He had been on the bench a long time, and now the sore spot was getting stiff as well. Every step sent a sharp needle of pain lancing up the muscles of his back, but Ben knew that he must ignore the pain. It was now or never with Ben. The scrubs put the ball into play. Ben took the first pass from Mace, began to dribble down the floor. Each step was agony. Ben tried to outrace the shadow that was at his elbow, but he lacked the speed. Before he could even get well underway, a long arm reached out and took the ball from him. Ben looked around in time to see Lard Adams toss the ball to Lassiter, who pivoted around a scrub and tossed the ball in for a 2-point counter. Ben realized that he had looked clumsy, but he couldn't help it, not with his back injury slowing him down. "Hey, garage mechanic, why don't you go back to the garage? You don't belong on a basketball court." The voice belonged to one of the cadets in the stand. Ben tried to ignore it, but it preyed on his mind. So the other cadets were holding his background against him, too. It wasn't a comforting thought. even though Ben had half expected it. The scrub center threw the ball into play. He threw it at Ben. But Ben didn't come out of his thoughts quickly enough, and the ball bounded off his shoulder. The next thing Ben knew, the coach was yelling for him to get out of the game. Ben left the game, and he felt no better when the coach, without even looking at him, said, "Go on in and take your shower, Mason. You won't be playing anymore." Ben limped toward the shower room. The coach had said he wouldn't be playing anymore. Did that mean today? Or did it mean that he wouldn't be playing anymore all season? The answer that Ben would have liked to believe was impossible for him to even consider. Later, the rest of the players swarmed into the shower room. As they splashed about, Ben saw that Rod King was not among them. But Jack Lassiter was. Lassiter yelled at Ben, "Well, plebe, how does it feel to be the star of the bench sitters?" Ben forced a smile and said nothing. He dressed slowly, as did all the rest of the squad. The coach had promised them he would post the list of squadsmen, and everyone was anxious to read that list. Ben, although he had given up hope, was curious, and for that reason alone he remained. After several minutes, Captain Craig and Rod King came out of the coach's office. There was a sheet of paper in Craig's hand. Craig started to post the paper on the bulletin board, then, looking at the eager faces around him, said suddenly, "I see that you're all waiting. Very well, I'll read you the list that we finally decided on. These men shall stay." The coach looked around in a room that was suddenly quiet. "These men," he repeated, "shall stay. On the varsity, there will be Brown, Lassiter, King, Adams, and Chase. The second team will be composed of Cardigan, Mace, Whalen, Blue, and Holt." Ben Mason had expected the worst, but now that it had come, it was hard for him to take. He saw the looks of triumph on the faces of Lassiter and Lard Adams. He watched grimly as they nodded at each other, then stared in his direction. But the coach was talking again. "In addition to those teams, there will be a squad of 6 reserves. Marston, Kennedy, Sitka, Holden, Moore, and—" Again the coach's eyes swept the room. "And Mason," he finished. "Well, that's all. I'm sorry I can't choose more of you. The rest of you can go. You team members can wait a minute. I want to talk to you." Ben Mason was too amazed to say anything. It seemed as if he had been yanked up from the very depths of despair. When the 16 chosen ones were alone, the coach said, "Men, I'm depending on you for a winning team. I've chosen you with Rod King's help because I honestly believe you're the best basketball players in the academy. 1 week from today, we tangle with Corona, our first opponent. We want to win that game, and we want to win it badly. In order to make things easier for all of you, I'm going to see that we get a training table at once. All 16 of you will report to the table instead of to the regular cafeteria meals. Mason, you're the only plebe on the squad. I'll be calling on the basketball men at all hours, and it's nicer to have them all under the same roof. So I'm having you assigned to the upper-class dormitory. There's a vacant room on the 2nd floor, right next to Rod King. Effective at once, you're to move there. That's all." "Well, Mr. Smarty," Jack Lassiter said as they left the gym, "I see that you're just tickled to death at the way things have turned out." Ben smiled. "Yes, I'm tickled. From the look on your face, though, Lassiter, I'd say that you're displeased." "Listen," Lassiter snarled. "When you talk to me, don't forget to say sir. And another thing, you wouldn't be on the squad now if Rod King wasn't taking care of you. Who do you suppose got you on the squad if King didn't? A lot of sense he's got, bringing a garage mechanic into a dorm where nobody but upperclassmen are supposed to stay." With that thought, Lassiter moved away. But as he did, a perturbing thought came to Ben. Spying Rod a few minutes later, Ben called him aside. "Rod," he said, "Lassiter says you got me on the squad." "Don't be silly. The coach said you showed enough in 4 minutes to deserve your chance. Tough about your injury." "Just the same," Ben persisted, "they're saying you helped me. Look, Rod, I appreciate your friendship, but I know how I'm regarded around here. Being friendly with me won't help your standing any. So from now on, I'm asking you not to have anything to do with me." This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to The Winning Basket. You can find a link to our podcast on the Marshall Public Library webpage, www.marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.